So this is titled SPL, What, How and When. It's a repeat with updates of a presentation I did back in November. So I hope that's not disappointing anyone that's come on expecting an extension of the November talk. It's a repeat with a few updates. And as it says on the front slide there, this is just a guide. It probably includes a few of my own views, but at the end of the day, it's the regulation that counts. The presentation takes about 40 minutes, and we've got time for Q&A, which Luke is going to handle. So please, could you, if you think of things, just sort of jot them down, and we'll do it that way rather than picking up questions as we go along. Thanks very much. So what's the background to all this? Well, the background is Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing, SFCL, which is a sailplane specific version of the old flight crew licensing rules that came out of the European Aviation Safety Agency many years ago. The problem with the FCL rules is that they are designed for commercial air transport type activity, and it's sort of filtered down into general aviation, and of course eventually it filters down into gliding and indeed balloons and other types of aircraft. And it was discovered fairly quickly that the FCL rules were far too complicated, not really appropriate for sailplanes. So working through the European Gliding Union, known as the EGU, the BGA and other gliding federations across Europe, back to EASA and said, look, this isn't going to work. We need to do something different. And to our surprise, they agreed. They said, yeah, we get that. So they said, if you guys sit down with us and help us redesign the rules, we'll do it. So came SFCL, Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing. Of course, sailplanes include all powered sailplanes, which include touring motor gliders. So all of those are included under SFCL, Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing. Now, the rules were sort of developed by that working group that I just discussed, really, with EASA during 18 and 19. And they're applicable in the UK and elsewhere from April 2020. So they're in place now, but they're not actually required to be used in the UK until October 21. How do we get to that October 21 date? Well, all these regulations come with an implementation period of a year. The CAA is going to add 6 months to that for an exemption. So that gives us till October 21 to get ourselves sorted out. All the details of SFCL, Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing, are in what's called the Sailplane Easy Access Rulebook. There's a picture of it on the slide there, and there's the URL there. So all the rules applicable to sailplanes are in one place, which is kind of convenient. Bit of a dry slide amongst other dry slides. This is the construct of Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing, which is kind of, very similar to the construct of all European Aviation Safety Agency rules and regulations. So at the top level, you've got a rule. This is a hard law rule that usually involves sort of political input to agree it. And in this particular case, to give you an example, 155 launching methods. What this rule will say is words to the effect of a pilot must be trained in the launch method being used. So pretty high level, pretty broad brush. And below that level, you get what's called acceptable means of compliance, which is law. This is law that's agreed at a EASA or a kind of CAA type level. And this is where all the detail sits. So for example, in this particular case, here under this particular AMC, acceptable means of compliance, is the instructions for teaching self-launch. It'll be the syllabus and all the stuff that kind of wraps around that. And then kind of below that level, you get something called guidance material, which is pretty much what it says on the tin. And I think in this particular case, for the launching methods, it gives guidance on what to do if you're using a launch method that's not covered elsewhere in the rules. So for example, if you're doing gravity launching, pushing a glider down a slope to launch it, it sort of says, go and talk to your CAA about it if you want some rules, or kind of infers, in other words, on with it. So you've got the three layers there. The middle one and the bottom one, they're not easy to change, but can be changed. The top one, as I said, requires political input. Very difficult to change. So let's talk a little bit about the license structure now. So under SFCL, the Sailplane Flight Crew Licensing, there is a single license called the Sailplane Pilot License, known as the SPL. So it's a single license called the SPL. And that SPL can be used with the choice of medical certificate, either the LAPL, Light Aircraft Pilot License Medical, or the Class 2 medical choice. And the good news is that we can expect a UK-only alternative of a pilot medical declaration in early 21. Word of caution on that, we're not clear what the requirements are going to be and who can use it, but it is almost certainly going to be very helpful. The SPL, the Sailplane Pilot's License, comes with passenger carrying privileges built in, subject to pilot's experience, and the privileges of the license can include self-launch, cloud flying, aerobatics, TMG, as it says on the slide there, and sailplane towing, but in a TMG, because you can fly a TMG on an SPL. And an important point is that the license is non-expiring, but is subject to rolling recency. We'll spend a little bit of time this evening talking about rolling recency, so hopefully that'll be pretty clear to you. A little bit more about the licensing structure. So you can add flight instructor sailplanes privileges to a license. That's known as the FIS. And again, that's non-expiring, which is a bit new to us, isn't it? But it is subject to rolling recency. And an FIS, a flight instructor sailplanes, must hold an SPL, including the privileges that are being taught, which is cool. Flight examiner sailplanes, or the FES, is slightly different. This does have a expiry, so it expires after 5 years and has revalidation requirements if you step forward before the 5 years up, or slightly different renewal requirements if you go past the 5 years. The privileges of an FES increase with experience. There's only a single examiner rating with extendable privileges. So an inexperienced examiner would test pilots, and a more experienced examiner would test instructors. Gives you kind of an idea of how it works. And unsurprisingly, an examiner has got to hold an SPL and an FIS certificate as well. So let's talk a little bit about rolling recency now. This is a very new thing. This is a very new thing to most pilots. We're all kind of used to currency and that being sort of guidelines. This is, and it's a legal requirement. So it's a license holder responsibility. It's your license, it's your recency. And the recency requirements do vary a bit from privilege to privilege. So if your life in gliding is pretty simple, so say you fly a glider off the winch or off aerotow every now and again, like an awful lot of pilots do, then actually it's pretty straightforward. In fact, it's really straightforward. But if you're an instructor and you do various things, fly touring motor gliders, it gets a bit more complicated. The good news is that if you fall out of recency, in other words, you don't meet the recency requirements, that usually means just making up the difference with flying with an instructor or supervised by an instructor. It actually isn't massively different to how we deal with it in clubs now. So there's a kind of question to ask yourself when you're using the privileges of an SPL. Have I met the recency requirements needed for the flight I'm planning to do? And most of the time that'll be straightforward. Other times it may need a little bit of thinking about. So this looks more complicated than it is, but let's just work through this. So what we're looking at here is rolling recency for an SPL holder. I'll put there excluding TMG, because this is an SPL holder is just flying a sailplane, maybe a self-launching sailplane, but not a TMG. So what that pilot needs to do before he leaps off, or he or she leaps off the ground, is just make sure that they've done 5 hours, including 15 launches and 2 training flights as an instructor in the 24 months, which isn't a massive amount. 5 hours, including 15 launches and 2 training flights in the past 24 months. Any time in that past 24 months. If they can't meet that requirement, and they can't make up that requirement by flying with an instructor or something, or don't want to, there's an alternative of passing a test with an examiner, but I can't imagine there's actually many pilots who do that or do that. The flow chart on the right kind of works through it. So let's just have a quick look at that. At the top box, have I done 5 hours, including 15 launches in the previous 4 months? Yep. Have I done 2 flights with an instructor in the previous 24 months? And those 2 flights can be 1 minute long or 1 hour long. Doesn't matter. Just have to do 2 flights with an instructor. And if yes, and do you meet the launch type recency? We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's say yes, and then you go flying. But if you can't, if you can't at any step of the way, can't say yes, then you can kind of make up the experience either flying with an instructor or in most cases flying under the supervision of an instructor. That's how it works. So 5 hours, including 15 launches and 2 training flights with a flight instructor. That is the basic minimum recency for an SPL. Remember, this never has to be put in front of an examiner, never has to be sent to the CAA, nobody has to sign your license. All you have to do is maintain recency. If you fall out of recency, you have to get yourself back into recency. Look at it, let's have a look at it now with TMG privileges, because it suddenly gets very complicated, and there's a good reason for that. Well, I don't know if it's a good reason, but there's a reason for it. So on the working group at EASA, and I was one of the guys that was involved, we actually came up with quite a simple solution for touring motor gliders for SPL holders. But the guys from European Aviation Safety Agency from EASA, very helpful guys. Of the 2 on the team, one was a gliding instructor from Germany, kind of really knew his stuff. But they said, unfortunately, because aeroplane pilots can also have TMG privileges, they had to have the same requirements on both licenses. So it's got a bit complicated there for those that have TMG privileges. But when you actually look at it, it's not heavy at all. It's not dissimilar to what people are used to under national requirements. Let's move on. So launch type recency, I mentioned that because that's obviously, well, not obviously, but that's something that you have to be compliant with before you take a launch. So if it's a winch launch, a self-launch, or an aerotow, in the 24 months before leaping off the ground, you've got to make sure you've done 5 launches of the required type. And you'll see in the small type there, for self-launch, you can include touring motor glider takeoffs because there aren't actually that many 2-seat self-launching things around. So EASA recognise that. So they've said, yeah, you can include TMB takeoffs. For bungee, it's a lot less. It's 2 launches. And remember, those launches can be solo or they can be with an instructor. You just need to have done 5 launches of the required type in the previous 24 months. Or 2 if it's more. There is no rocket launch, I'm afraid. Let's have a look at a real world example just to kind of reinforce this. So an SPL, Sailplane pilot license holder, wants to take an aerotow as a pilot in command. Let's say that this person normally flies on the winch, so it's kind of rare for them to do an aerotow, so they've got to think about it. So have they done the 5 hours and 15 launches of any type, 2 training flights with an instructor? Yep, they can remember that or they check that. But in the past 24 months, have they flown 5 aerotow launches? When they check the logbook, no, it's only 4. Okay, well, the solution is to talk to an instructor and either fly with an instructor, or if the instructor's happy to just really get on with it, fly solo supervised by the instructor. And that's how it works in real life. And there are a number of countries already doing this stuff. Rolling recency for instructors then. So you may recall that I said that it gets more complicated the further you make your own life complicated in gliding. But for instructors, it's there's an additional feature here. So you've got to have your SPL recency. If you're instructing, there's a bit of additional recency to think about. So the FIS certificate or the FIS privileges on the license are non-expiring, which is very new, isn't it? Because we've been used to expiring every year, but they don't expire anymore, providing you maintain rolling recency. So prior to instructing at any time, in the previous 3 years, not 2 years, you need to have done 30 hours, 60 launches instructing. Now, 30 hours instructing is in 3 years is actually probably quite a lot if you fly, I don't know, launch near the seaside. Okay, I'm not sure why my computer, but I'll sort that out. But 60 launches is not massive a year, isn't it? So you've got to do 30 hours or 60 launches instructing in the past 3 years. I mean, you could have done it all 2 years ago. That's fine, as long as you've done it all in the past 3 years. And you must have attended a refresher seminar. BJ is running a load of those at the moment online for anyone that needs one. So it's the 30 hours, 60 launches and refresher seminar. And there's this other feature here, which is looked a bit unusual. And in the previous 9 years, you need to have flown with a flight instructor. So you've got to have the experience, you've got to have attended a seminar, we do those online. And in the previous 9 years, you need to have had a flight with a flight instructor coach. So again, there's the flow chart on the right there. What's different here, of course, is when we work our way down that flow chart, you get to the bit where it says, about halfway down, have you done 30 hours or 60 launches instructing in the last 3 years? The answer is no. Then you've got to have a test from the examiner. You can't sort of jump in a two-seater and build up some experience. At that point, you have to have a flight with an examiner. So it's a kind of bit like now when you can't revalidate for some reason at the end of the year in BGA land. Inevitably, you end up flying with an RE or something like that. So it's much the same sort of thing if you haven't met the 30 hours or 60 launches. But at least then you can have a test with an examiner, and if the examiner's happy, off you go again. So it's not kind of world-ending stuff. But anyway, let's have a talk now about the previous 9 years flight with an FIC. What's that all about? So just rolling back to the working group at European Aviation Safety Agency, where all this stuff was dreamt up. In the flying world generally, most instructors have to fly with an examiner every few years. And that was the case for sailplane instructors under the old SFCL rules. But here we're dealing with a new set of rules, aren't we? SFCL. And in the working group, the Germans in particular, supported by their French, British, and various other colleagues from Scandinavia and places like that, they said, well, actually, we need to probably reduce the amount of flying that instructors have to do with examiners. And the main reason that the Germans were pushing on this is because in Germany, examiners are paid for what they do. They're a little bit difficult to get hold of. And actually, what our understanding is they're not particularly popular, unlike our very friendly, cuddly examiners in the UK. But anyway, so of course we supported them because we all work together across Europe on the gliding side. So the EASA said, okay, well, happy to listen. What's your alternative? And they said, well, wouldn't it be better if instructors every now and again flew with a flight instructor coach? In other words, somebody who is able to teach them how to improve their instruction. Because kind of most of us need a bit of a tweak every now and again. It doesn't do us any harm. And they said, actually, that's a really good idea. So what they've come up with is every 9 years, every instructor has to demonstrate their competence as an instructor to a flight instructor coach. Now, the process for doing that in the UK hasn't yet been sorted. We've spoken to the CA about it and made a sensible suggestion to them having a think about. And let's just talk a little bit now about how it will work in the future and how it works for those of us that have converted from BGA to get an FI certificate. So for those who are completing a sailplane flight crew licensing sailplane course at the end of this year onwards, then within 9 years of completing that course, they'll have had to have done a flight with a flight instructor coach using the process that we've yet to approve. I mean, it'll be a case of finding a flight instructor coach, jumping in the glider, doing whatever, and then having the logbook signed. I mean, that's basically the process. But for those of us that are not doing that course, who are already instructors and are converting across from BGA instructor rating to an FIS, then what we've agreed with the CAA in writing is that the 9 years, the clock will start on the 9 years from the instructor's last BGA 3 or 5 year check. Now, we can still do 3 or 5 year checks now. Some clubs don't do 3 years, but all clubs do 5 years. And we're going to obviously stop doing those, or say obviously, we're going to stop doing those at the end of the year when we change over to the new system. So for now, if you want to use the privileges of your FIS certificate, and you think, yeah, I've had this FIS certificate for a long time, the 9 years can be counted from your last BGA or 5-year check. Now, what you'll need to do is make sure that BGA 3 or 5-year check that you might have had recently or might be having this year or whenever, just make sure it's signed in your logbook, because you might need to refer back to it in years to come. Now, flying with an instructor flying with an examiner, with a flight instructor coach every 9 years isn't a kind of major burden. 9 years isn't that frequent. And actually, some CFIs worry about that because they say, crikey, if my instructors aren't going to be flown with till for another 8 years' time, how do I know if they're going off the boil? Well, the reality is that using the guidance material in the rule, CFIs can have whatever standardization activity they want. It's their toy box, their instructors do whatever they feel is appropriate. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be over the top, but an instructor is probably worth looking at every few years rather than every 9 years, and CFIs can be fun and interesting to do at the gliding club to deal with that. Let's talk a little bit now about the license conversion. We'll start off by looking at the requirements. Now, when I say license conversion, this is moving from BGA stuff, hence the picture of the logbook and the gliding certificate, across to the SPL, the Sailplane pilot license. And as you can read on the screen yourself, the standard, or the basic standard that's required, is the bronze and cross-country endorsement. That is equivalent to the SPL. Now, some of us, like me, didn't do the cross-country endorsement, as it wasn't invented when we were lads. So for those that were, been around gliding a bit, therefore wouldn't have done the cross-country endorsement, the alternative is the silver distance. A bronze and cross-country endorsement, or bronze and silver distance, allows you to apply for an SPL. Any additional BGA endorsements that you might have, for example, crowd flying, aerobatics, or other exciting stuff like that, can be added through the conversion process to give you those additional privileges on your SPL. You don't lose any privileges. If you've got SLMG class rating now, then that then becomes TMG privileges on an SPL. When you apply for TMG privileges on an SPL, you automatically get self-launching privileges on your SPL. A BGA assistant and full instructor, so either or, becomes a flight instructor sailplane. So there's a kind of single instructor standard under on the SPL. So either an assistant or full rated instructor gets the FI, flight instructor sailplanes privilege on their SPL. Commitment, is that the right word? What I'm trying to get at here is that if you convert your SPL, say you converted your SPL in February or something, you can just chuck your SPL in your top drawer. You don't need to use it or its privilege, because you don't have to actually comply with all this stuff October 21. Now, if you do want to use your SPL, some people use it because they use the TMG privileges to fly TMGs. Yeah, I'm fine. If you do that, you must comply fully with the sailplane flight crew licensing requirements and the medical requirements. You can't mix and match. You can't use a bit of SPL and a bit of BGA. You've got to use one or the other. So most glider pilots will be just parking their SPLs for now and using their BGA gliding certificate, etc., until October next year. Same with instructors. We are using the BGA instructor rating. Even if you've got an FIS certificate, you will have a BGA instructor rating through your CFI. That's what we're using until such point as we're not anymore, around October, towards the end of next year. And remember, if you are using FIS privileges, you can only do that within a declared training organisation. And we'll talk more about that in a while. I sound a bit husky. I've had a bit of a cough today, hopefully not COVID. The process then. So you can read that yourself. One of the big issues there is number 2, or the second bullet, which is think about the detail, because the guidance is really good. Actually, it's been used a lot. It works really well. But really think about the detail, because you may have privileges through BGA that you just haven't used for a long time, and you think, actually bring those across through the conversion process, because if you've got them on your license, kind of it's there for the future, might save you a whole heap of hassle later on. The way the process works is once you've kind of done your form and filled it in, it takes a while, but it's worth doing it carefully. Then you whiz it off to the BGA, and then we check everything, because we've obviously got your data on file somewhere, very on our back office system actually, and we check it all. And then what we do is we make a recommendation to the CA based on what you've applied for. We do that through an approved process. We've got a what's called a qualified entity approval to make recommendations for license issues to the CAA. We've done loads. I mean, well over 1,000 successfully. And then what the CAA does, it looks at our recommendation and literally turns the handle and prints licenses. They print the licenses, they send them back to us. The guys in the office check those, make sure they're correct, and then send them off to you with some guidance, like not chopping it up, because that makes it invalid, and various other bits and pieces. And of course, then for you, you have your SPL, and there is no more CA involvement. This is a non-expiring license that doesn't involve examiners, doesn't involve the CAA. It just involves you doing enough flying to keep it recent, and that's it. And all the information there is at that URL on our website. I mean, if you just Google BGA pilot license conversion, you'll end up in the right place. Bit of advice here. So pilots, we would say, qualify as soon as you can to convert to SPL. So that means achieve the bronze country endorsement. A lot of pilots get to bronze and they kind of just, okay, maybe I'll get around to the cross-country endorsement. Don't go very far. Actually, until you've reached that cross-country endorsement standard, you're not a qualified pilot under BGA requirements, let alone any others. So get yourself to cross-country endorsement, and then you can apply for that. Your life will be pretty straightforward. And we would encourage any CFIs that are listening to please support their pilots in getting there, and CFIs will know what I mean by that. Now, if you're unable to meet the conversion requirement by October 21, what's the deal? Well, I mean, the chances are that if you're learning to fly, you won't have got to cross-country endorsement by October next year. That's understandable. Or perhaps you won't be 16 by then, in which case you can't have a cross-country endorsement or a license. So that's fine. That's just the way it is. Well, we've worked this out with CAA. We've kind of advised CAA on the way forward with this, and they recognise that providing your BGA training record to show where you are, that can be carried across the new system, credited into the new system. So it's really important that your club training records that you've got are kept up to date. That's the record card, signed and sealed and delivered, and your logbook as well as a kind of backup. I would urge, as I would anyway, but urge all pilots that are learning to fly to make sure their record card and logbook are kept up to date. And for those worried about a Class 2 or LAPA medical, because there are some people out there, some people are worried about it, a lot of people just don't want to do it because they think it's pointless, which I completely understand. So what I say to those people is wait, because as I said earlier in the presentation, the EFT, Department for Transport, CAA, are responding to some very strong lobbying that's been going on for a while, and they anticipate putting together a statutory instrument which introduces a pilot medical declaration for all recreational pilots in the UK only from whenever it's produced next year. We're expecting it in January or February. Bound to be delayed a bit, but certainly in the first part of the year. What about the basic instructor or BI rating? Well, a little bit of background, which will be useful, or will certainly illustrate why we are where we are and where this is going. So quite a few years ago, well before my time working for the BGA and the CAA got together to discuss the air navigation order rules that required anyone flying a passenger who was paying for the flying to operate under an air operator certificate. And airlines used to operate under, or they could do it as an instructional flight. So they ended up with a scenario where you had all these people coming in, because you always need new people coming into gliding. For every 100 that try it, one takes it up. So you need a lot of people coming to try gliding. So the way to establish a legal way forward for the passenger paying for the flight was to introduce a simple instructor rating. And that simple instructor rating was called the Air Experience Instructor. That eventually morphed into the basic instructor. So that situation has stayed as it is for a number of years. But under the current air navigation order rules and the current European Aviation Safety Agency rules, in fact, a qualified pilot of whatever category of aircraft can carry a passenger who paid for the flight. So it no longer needs to be an instructor. It can be a qualified pilot. Now, when all these rules changed a few years ago, we went to the membership, which is the BGA clubs, and said, look, this is changing, but we've still got the same issues we've always got insofar as we need to make sure this is done to a required standard and that the activity is insurable. Really important. You know, we manage risks very carefully. So the membership, as in the clubs, agreed that what we should do is introduce something that could replace the BI rating that had to happen. We introduced a thing called the Introductory Flight Pilot Endorsement, the BGA endorsement. It's not a license thing, it's a BGA endorsement. And it's there just to make sure that we have the assured standard of people flying passengers who are paying for the flying, and it's an insurable activity. Now, the IFP training is the safety training from a BI course. So the only bit that's removed is the instructing bit. So it's kind of half of a BI course. It's a one-day thing. Come October, there is no BI rating because it doesn't exist under Sailplane flight crew licensing. So existing BIs don't have to do anything. They'll just get an email from the BGA that says you now automatically hold BGA introductory flight pilot privileges. So they carry on doing what they're doing, but without the instructing element. They can carry on carrying passengers for their club. So ideally, we would have been able to hang on to the BI rating. It's kind of one of the things that we tried quite hard on, but we were the only country in Europe doing it, and therefore we weren't able to take that forward. The good news is that BIs can continue as IFPs. What about the BGA Motor Glider Instructor Rating, the BGA MGIR? Now, this was another one that made us a little bit anxious in the working group at EASA. And why on earth have an MGIR anyway? Well, it's been really useful, and actually it's vitally important because what it does, it allows instructors who have got a motor glider class rating of some sort to safely teach gliding exercises in motor gliders. They're not actually teaching people to fly, you know, with a throttle and teach people how to fly powered aircraft. They're teaching gliding exercises in motor glider. For example, field landings, navigation, circuits, whatever else you want to use a motor glider for. They're very flexible, very useful. Well, when we were at this EASA working group, the EASA, European Aviation Safety Agency, had looked into this and they said, there isn't a problem. To explain. So they said, look, if you're a flight instructor sailplanes, you can teach people to fly sailplanes. And a touring motor glider is a sailplane, but you can teach people to fly. Good. And then they said, if that instructor holds an SPL with TMG privileges, that means they can fly a TMG. Yep. Well, when you put the two together, you have a flight instructor sailplanes who can teach gliding exercises in a TMG. In other words, there's no requirement to have an additional rating in a motor glider. You just have to be qualified to fly the aircraft, which, when you think about it, makes complete sense. So that's explained in the regulation. I've referenced a guidance note there with a complicated number that explains that to those who come across the rule for the first time. Now, how's that going to work in reality at gliding clubs? How do we manage the risk, which is a question that CFIs often come up with and other instructors? Well, you know, the whole thing about this sailplane flight crew licensing rule is it's pretty high level. It's not overly prescriptive, and it kind of gives clubs and operators a bit of flexibility in how they operate. And so what we're going to have to do is help CFIs and clubs by providing a bit of guidance on how to manage this activity and keep things as safe as they've been for a very long time. So what happens if somebody is solo but not SPL qualified? So they're solo, but they haven't got an SPL after October 21. They want to continue solo flying after October 21, but they haven't got an SPL. How's that going to work? Well, under these rules, pilots who don't hold an SPL are student pilots. You're either an SPL holder and therefore qualified, or you're a student pilot. And the rules require student pilots to be formally authorized and supervised in flight. There's the rule that makes it clear, I think. So this is something a little bit new. We already supervise pilots who haven't reached bronze with cross-country endorsement. It's done in a more informal way than is going to be required going forward. So again, this is an area where we're producing guidance for CFIs and instructors, both to help them get it right, but also, that said, make sure they don't gold plate it and get too carried away, because they don't need to. So a little bit of a table, which is a useful summary at this stage, I think. On the left there, you've got the BGA certified pilot as we are now, and you carry on with that till October 21. And then you've got the SPL holder on the right-hand side, which will be required from October 21, as we said earlier. And you can see the differences there. So, at the moment, we follow BJ currency guidance, but in the future, we've got to comply with that minimum SFCL recency requirement. It's a requirement, not guidance. At the moment, we comply with BJ medical requirements. In the future, we're going to have to comply with what are called the Part Med requirements, which is the LAPL medical or the Class 2 medical. But as it says there, and as I've mentioned a few times now, we can expect change to, or an option of pilot medical declaration for the UK only from early 2020. At the moment, we comply with the Sailplane Air Operations rules. Most people don't know that, they're not aware of that, because actually the Sailplane Air Operations rules, which were again designed by glider pilots, are pretty much how we operate gliders everywhere in Europe, including the UK anyway. So in the future, we're going to have to comply with the same set of rules because they exist now and they're not going away. And at the moment, we follow club rules. In the future, we'll follow club rules. Nothing changes. Just because you've got a license doesn't mean you don't follow club rules. What about sailplane flight crew licensing pilot training? What on earth does that mean? So what happens if you're going to be training under these new rules? You're training for an SPL. So you won't be surprised to hear that sailplane flight crew licensing training, so training for an SPL, needs to take place under Declared Training Organisation, or DTO rules. So another bit of background: originally, European Aviation Safety Agency, IATA, had once again looked at the airline training sort of thing and said, oh, okay, well, we have approved training organisations to train airline pilots, so surely that'll work for GA pilots and glider pilots. Well, the answer is, of course, it's not going to work. And very quickly that became apparent where these rules were being used. And so once again, through the European Gliding Union, the whole European gliding community went back to IATA and said, this isn't going to work. So they've come up with Declared Training Organisation rules. So these DTO rules define the training content, which is handy. So the syllabus and the bits that wrap around it, how to deliver the syllabus, and just make sure that the training is properly organised under the CFI. The way it works is the organisation that's delivering the training, the gliding club, just declares that it's complying with those rules and gets on with it. And actually, the book of rules isn't that thick, which is great. So what about SFCL pilot training for an SPL or training for additional privileges? Hey, look, it's going to be just pretty much as it is now for training for the bronze country endorsement. In other words, you kind of do flying training, you learn some stuff, you fly solo, brilliant. So you're kind of really making good progress, and you learn some more, you complete some theory stuff, read some books, do a test, and do a flying test with somebody. And at the end of it, instead of getting a bronze in cross-country endorsement like you do now, that's going out the window in October next year, you get an SPL instead, you get a license instead. Once again, pilots who started their training before the changeover to these DTO rules will have their recorded BJ training credited to their new training course. Again, really important just to make sure that your BGA training records are nicely up to speed, certainly towards the back end of next year, if they aren't already sorted. Question that often comes up: is the gliding club a DTO? No, emphatically no. The gliding club doesn't really change. It's still a gliding club. Do stuff, beer, fly gliders, drive winches, and do all the other things you do in a gliding club. It's the training bit of a gliding club that changes a bit. The training bit of the gliding club becomes the DTO. So it's the SFCL, the Sailplane Flight License and Training, so for the SPL, the cloud flying rating, the touring motor glider stuff, all that sort of stuff happens within a sort of DTO framework. All the instructors operate within that DTO framework under the CFI, and so do the students. So, it's not going to be a separate building. It's not going to be a separate anything really, although it just will have a set of requirements, as I said, in a little manual, which says this is how we do things in the DTO. DTO sits with it. What are we doing in BGA land to kind of help clubs deal with this? Well, actually, a hell of a lot. The project that we've got going has got about 35 items on it that are all making progress to make sure that it's going to be gliding clubs. One of the big things that we're doing is we're developing the courses. So if you've got the SPL course, the instructor's course, the cloud flying, blah, 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 all these courses. So we're writing all those. We've had a number of them approved by the CAA already, because that's part of the process. Is they've looked at by the CAA and rubber stamped as an approved course. And we get all that done. We're paying for that as well. And we're producing these things called course programs, which is a syllabus but with padding around it, so everybody knows what's going on, whether it's the student or whether it's the instructor. It's really clear from a kind of single document. Having seen what goes on in the Netherlands and Germany with their student manual, which is a kind of standardized thing they're using, there's an image of one page of it there on the screen. I think that's in German. Yeah, it's in German. What we really like about it is it's up to date, it's modern, it's not an instructor's manual, it's not even a manual about learning to fly. It's a student manual that kind of explains the sort of stuff that can often get glossed over at a busy launch point. So a student can read this stuff, when they've got nothing else to do at home, or if they're hanging around at the gliding club, they can read it, waiting for the rain to stop, or they can sort of dig it out just after they've flown with a busy instructor who hasn't got time to spend time with them and discussing stuff. Dig it out and have a read and just make sure they're up to speed with everything that they need to be. See from the diagrams there, see from the image there that in actual fact this thing is full of really good illustrations and it's very up to date. I mean, on that particular page you can see FLARM, you can see it as well as the classic, all the things that students in the future are going to be exposed to. We're also developing, as well as the course programs, we're developing a DTO manual template. The BGA has been a DTO, or is a DTO, and has been for a few years now, to deliver some of the stuff that people who have already converted to SFCL, to their SPL, need or want. So we've got a bit of experience now of what it's like to operate a DTO. Pretty straightforward, actually. We've been audited a couple of times by the CAA in that process. That wasn't too onerous at all. It's a case of they come along, have a look at some records, make sure everything's being done in line with the declaration, and then disappear again for a couple of years. So it's that sort of approach. The DTO manual template for a gliding club is about 3 or 4 pages long, something like that. Let's move on. A little bit of a comparison table again. So we've got club pilot training now on the left, and we've got club DTO training on the right. Same people, same operation, slightly different rules. So we're following BGA training requirements at the moment. Well, the BGA's training requirements will be the DTO training requirements, using the course programs and all the other stuff that we're all going to have access to. Still supported by the BGA regional teams, that's the SREs and their people. And of course, the CFI is still there managing the instructing team, same CFI, hopefully a few new instructors as well. The bronze flying test, remember the bronze is being replaced, becomes the SPL flying test. Instead of being done by a full rated instructor, it's being done by a flight exam on the sailplane. Now, a number of the full rated instructors are converting across to their SPLs with examining privileges. So we're confident we'll have plenty of examiners around. At the moment, the BGA syllabus is supplied by the BGA. Well, funny old thing, the flight crew licensing training syllabuses are also going to be supplied by the BGA, so not a lot changes there. One of the things that will, well, not a lot changes. What will change is subject to conversations we've got to have with clubs, but we're hoping to reduce, these course programs as a reasonably high quality document that will last the fairly long period of time it will take the average student to get through the syllabus. Occurrence reporting, so that's incidents and accidents, nothing changes there. And as mentioned before, the unqualified, as I call it, the pre-bronze with cross-country indoor solo pilots at the moment are informally supervised. Well, that changes to formal supervision under the new regime. Okay, nearly there. So this is a question that comes up. Quite a few people have already converted. Well, I think 1,200 or so have converted across to get a license over the past few years, because this whole change from BGA to a license has been an ongoing process, which is finally going to come to fruition in October next year. So anyone who was issued with a license before April this year, when the new SFCL SPL rules came in, will have had the old type FCL flight crew licensing, or S, light aircraft planes, or SPL. So people have been asking, oh God, what have I got? I've got the old license. Do I have to get a new one? The answer is no, because the regulation, Article 3B of the regulation, makes it really clear that if you've got one of those old Lapel S's, as they were called, or an SPL issued under the flight crew licensing rules that were around before April 20, then your license is deemed to be an SFCL SPL. What that means is it's viewed as an SFCL SPL. In other words, you don't need to throw it away and get a new one. You don't need to do anything. As far as the system is concerned and the law is concerned, you now have an SFCL SPL. But there is one thing you have to do, and that is follow the SFCL requirements. So that's recency and all the rest of it. So whereas before under FCL you had to jump through certain hoops to keep your license going, what you have to do now is think, okay, I now have to follow, if I want to use the privileges of my license, I now need to follow the Sailplane flight crew licensing requirement, not the old requirements under which my license was. Hopefully that makes sense. So there are some differences when adding privileges under Sailplane flight crew licensing. So say you have a plan towards the end of the year or next winter to do an aerobatics rating or aerobatics privileges under Sailplane flight crew licensing. So at your club, you kind of dig out the course for doing aerobatics, find an instructor who can teach it, you do the course, and then if the instructor's happy that you completed the course, the instructor signs your logbook. Job. That's it. It's the same for different launch types. It's the same for sailplane cloud flying. You do the training with the instructor and your logbook gets, nothing gets added to your license. So that's a bit different. The other bit that's a bit different is people who have got the old LAPLS or SPL with instructor privileges, so they've got an FIS on their old LAPLS or SPL, they'll notice that in the sort of bit that talks about instructor on their license, there'll be an instructor FIS expiry date. Well, that doesn't apply anymore, because under the SFCL rules, as we've discussed this evening, an FIS is a lifetime privilege with rolling recency. So if you've got one of those older licenses that's now deemed to be an SFCL SPL with flight instructor privileges, just ignore that expiry date. Don't cross it out and scribble on your license, because you're not supposed to do that, but just ignore it and instead apply the SFCL rolling recency requirements for the FIS, and then life will be good. So what's happening after the 1st of January? well, I watch the news like you do, so God knows. But but as far as this is concerned, the UK, as we all know, is retaining EU regulation under UK law. So, kind of delete EASA and insert UK. So EASA, sailplane flight licensing, becomes UK. EASA DTO becomes UK DTO. EASA SPL becomes UK SPL, and so on. EASA aircraft don't become UK aircraft, they become Part 21 aircraft. So if you've got a Molly 2B, which isn't an EASA aircraft, that becomes a non-Part 21 aircraft. Well, of course, having left the EU and having left EASA after the end of the year, so certainly by the 1st of January, there'll be opportunities for tweaks downstream. Well, certainly. I'll put a question mark there because it's a different question, but there will be. So the CAA has already launched a consultation on, opportunities for GA after EU and EASA exit. That's got a long way to go. Without doubt, over the coming years, there will be some. I think my final slide here is about operating in the EU after Brexit, because some glider pilots, like myself, actually like to occasionally visit other countries and go gliding. So let's talk about how that works in EU countries. So up until now, you've been able to use your LAPL S or your SPL in France or Germany and use your LAPL medical or your LAPL medical or your Class 2 medical. Well, the scribe in italics there comes out of a EASA document. A lot of words there. But basically what they're saying is that after the 1st of January, a pilot from the UK, a glider pilot from the UK flying in an EU country will have to comply with what are called the International Aviation Organization requirements. So ICAO Annex 1, which is pilot licensing. And in ICAO Annex 1, for those of you that haven't read it recently, it points out that the pilot requires a Class 2 medical. So from the 1st of January, when you're flying in the EU, i.e. outside the UK, using a UK issued SPL, you will require a Class 2 medical. And it's likely that your paperwork will require validation by the country that you're flying. If your SPL is issued by an EU country, for example, Germany or Sweden or whatever, then that doesn't apply, of course. So it's a UK issued license when used in the EU. So it's not a huge issue, but it's worth bearing in mind. Okay. So we're on to questions now, and Luke is going to look after any questions that might come up. So I'll just wait for him to. The answer is yes, but it won't give you SLMG on an SPL, it will give you TMG on the SPL. So just carry on. You carry on with your, if you've got an SPL, it'll become a UK SPL, and you can fly any sailplanes in the UK with an SPL. The only thing that would, Bruce, the thing that would screw your cunning plan is that the Eurofox isn't a sailplane. So you can teach gliding exercises in a sailplane if you hold an SPL FIS. So the answer is no. I think you'll find, Dave, that you don't need the recency. I'd have to double check that, maybe drop me an email, but I'm pretty sure that what you need to do is just have had the experience to be able to convert, but you can only use the SPL if you meet the recency requirements. We fight for all sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, without doubt, this is on our sort of target list for the future. please don't take that as, oh, it's all going to happen, be sorted out. The CAA, like most of government agencies, are overwhelmed at the moment. And actually, these opportunities that I've mentioned, that they'll definitely come, but don't hold your breath. Yeah, it's the same path everybody else has to take. So I think the UK is taking a pretty relaxed, view about who can hold an SPL in the UK, just like it has been doing for the last few years. I don't think that's going to change. If you're legally in the UK and you've got an SPL, then do an FIS the same way as everybody else. That's fine. Yeah, it's a good question, Jeff. I would say that if you've got the opportunity to do it between now and applying to convert under BGA, I would do it under BGA. I mean, the requirements are very similar, the standards are very similar, but it's just could be a bit less, could be a bit easier doing it under BGA. So why not? So the full rating effectively disappears. And this is a really good question, Paul. Because all full rated and system rated instructors end up with the same FIS privilege, the full rating disappears, as does the system rating, because you just got the FIS certificate. The way we're going to be advising club CFIs don't need the tool advice, but the way it will work at a gliding club, the CFI will say, okay, I've got these instructors, these ones are really experienced. Over the next few years, the CFIs probably think, well, they used to be a full count. But in future, it's just they're experienced. And so CFIs will have an idea which instructors can do what, who can supervise the airfield, who can teach field landings, who can do all this. And if I was a CFI, I've been one in the past, if I was a CFI in the future, I'm not planning to do that in a hurry, but if I was, then I would just have a perfectly transparent list on a website somewhere saying who could do what. So will a full rating have any validity? It won't have any applicability. So those of us who went through the mill of getting a LAPL S have now got an SPL. Because a LAPL S is deemed to be an SPL. So you've still got a license. Nothing's changed. I'm reading this now. So I've got an EASA FCL PPL, that's for aeroplanes. My TMG rating wasn't carried forward, but the CA website stated that. Oh, okay. Just the same question? Okay, well, look, if you haven't got TMG on a license, you can't fly using TMG. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. So if you providing you could meet the requirements that is in our license conversion guidance, you can have whatever you want. So if you can meet the requirements for having TMG privileges on your SPL, we'll help you get TMG privileges on your SPL. My advice is read the guidance on the BJ form, and if that doesn't help, then get in touch with us. So some time ago, the BJ wrote to all the CFIs and said, can you just advise us which of your instructors is currently teaching other instructors under kind of BGA processes? And they did that. So we made sure those instructors were defined as FICs through the BGA system. So anyone that's currently a BGA FIC can have the privileges to instruct other instructors, because it's not known as FIC under SFCL. We just use that term because everybody understands what it is. Actually, what it says in the regulation is that you can gain privileges to instruct other instructors. So you can gain those privileges through a process which we are defining with the CAA. If you're already an FIC under BGA, if you already coach instructors now, then you'll be able to carry on doing that when you convert to an SPL. No, because, well, you can up until the end of the year. From the 1st of January, because we're no longer in the EU, and the LAPL medical is an EU specific medical. They won't outside the UK. The EASA countries are not allowed to recognise a UK issued LAPL medical. Therefore, to fly in France or Spain, you will need your UK SPL, which is fine, with a Class 2 medical. So if he's got an MPPL SLMG, he should be able to apply for a SPL, which is TMG only. But if you can get through a cross-country endorsement, you'll be able to add TMG to a more regular Sailplane SPL. So, Mike, if this individual is struggling to work this out after that explanation, get him to drop us a line at the office. Ollie, is there any grace period on rolling recency? No, so say I was going to climb in a glider tomorrow, K13, do some instructing under this. I would have to check myself that I had done a refresher seminar at some point in the previous 3 years or 36 months. If it was last week, or if it was just under 3 years ago, that is absolutely fine. And there's no grace period. No, it is as it says on the tin. You've got to have met the requirement in the previous 3 years. No, I mean it's BGA policy absolutely not to gold plate, and actually that's proving to be quite difficult because the existing BGA stuff sometimes is a bit complicated, and we are simplifying things as much as we can through this process. To qualify as a CFI, well, a CFI is somebody that's appointed by a club chairman. It doesn't require a course. Course will give guidance on the requirements for the ideal requirements for a CFI. But if a club chairman wants to appoint one of the FISs of the club at the CFI, who's the BGA to argue? That CFI, if the club is doing SFCL training, which one would imagine they all will be, then that CFI will be expected to be the head of training of the club, and the head of training. There's a minimum experience required for a head of training. But to answer your question, we are not going to be banging extra requirements on top of the SFCL requirements. No, because the age 14 thing started with the ARTA anyway, so no, that hasn't changed. To do CCE assessments, cross-country endorsement assessment. So to test for a cross-country endorsement, you need to be a full-rated instructor with the privileges to fly whatever aircraft you're using. So we're still using BGA qualifications now with the cross-country endorsement. So providing that FES has a BGA full rating, because what we're talking here, we're mixing two things here. We're mixing EASA with BGA cross-country endorsement. So we're using BGA privileges for instructing. Cloud flying cross-country endorsed pilots are trained and assessed by BGA instructors. So the person doing the assessment needs to hold a BGA full rating. No, it's first quarter of next year, but I mean the CAA have been pointing at January, but if I was a betting man, I'd say February. But on this point, Colin, what I haven't mentioned this evening is today I saw a temporary exemption which we've encouraged the CAA to produce, which fills the gap between now and the statutory instrument coming out on this topic. So the statutory instrument, which is kind of a government thing, law change is going to appear in February, perhaps. So between now and then, we've got a whole bunch of licensed pilots who are going to have to rush around and get medicals, and actually, it's actually quite difficult to get one at the moment. So the CAA have written an exemption at our request that it exempts SPL holders from having to hold a Class 2 or a LAPL medical to use the privileges of their SPL, and they can instead use the PND. That hasn't been published yet. As soon as that's available, should be any time soon. It's embarrassing. Should be any time soon. We will publish that and make sure everybody's aware of it. So, but to answer your question, around February. No, there is no CRI for sailplanes included in the regulations. I think that is SPL TMG more difficult than LAPL S to LAPL A. Don't fully understand the question, Dave, but I'll do my best. So to add TMG privileges to an SPL, you have to do a few hours training in a TMG and be assessed to make sure you can do it. And then you have TMG privileges on an SPL. So I don't think it's particularly difficult. There's a couple of really good clubs that actually focus on TMG training. So that's the guys at Oxfordshire Sport Flying and the guys at Motorglide. They can help anyone whack a TMG onto an SPL. So I have an EASA PPL and I have an SPL with TMG. So any TMG recency that you've got on an aeroplane license can be crossed over to the TMG requirements on an SPL and vice versa. So you can continue to kind of mix them. It's actually spelt out in the regulation. So under sailplane flight crew licensing, the syllabus is slightly different. So, but not massively different. You won't be surprised to hear, because there's probably only really one sensible way to train a pilot. So exercise number, whatever it is, 16, I'm just guessing, under SFCL is field landings. And it's, it can be delivered in a very practical way, much like it is now. And cross country is, there isn't a nav test, but there's a cross country training element under navigation, exercise 17. And during that nav training, you would be assessed by your instructor to make sure that you're not going to get lost. I think one of the training outcomes is that the pilot knows what to do. Well, A, knows how to avoid getting lost, but B, knows what to do when they get lost. So and again, it's based on a 100K triangle, which is exactly how we do it now. So it's very, very, very similar, but it's not a formal test on navigation and field selection. It's assessment during training. Very similar. So you're doing a BGA assistant rating course, which is a BGA course. It's not an SFCL course. So when you, let me change how much. Yeah, so try and get your rating completed, as it were, before you apply to have this, added to your SPL, Sam. I don't know whether you've applied for an SPL yet, Sam, but I would just wait till you've kind of de-restricted your instructor rating, and then you'll get an unrestricted FIS certificate. And as I'm the guy that helped out your BI rating, I'm delighted that you're doing an FIS course. Doing an instructor's course, not an FIS course. Yeah, so insurers tend to be happy when you're complying with the law. That's generally how it works. I mean, I don't know how happy they are at the moment, because there are quite a few motor glider, SLMG and microlight instructors using pilot medical declaration. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Are they happy? We don't know whether they're happy or not. You know, we'll get to the bottom of this when we sit down with them, as we do regularly, and discuss risk, numbers of people with certain things. And there's no guarantee at the moment that instructors are going to be able to use the pilot medical declaration. We're strongly hoping that's the case. That's the sort of case we're making to the CAA, but there's no guarantee. But it's a great question, Keith, and we will continue to engage with the insurers as we always do. Lapse but extended. I don't know what that means, but to fly in the EU on an SPL, you need a Class 2 medical. To fly an aeroplane in the EU, you need an aeroplane license with a medical. You can't use a pilot medical declaration to operate outside the UK. I think the exemption is going to preclude you from doing that. So the exemption is just that I was talking about, that's going to be printed any day now, is for those that already have an SPL and need to use them but can't get access to an AME, an aeromedical examiner. So I would, if you want to do the PMD thing, I would wait until the SI has been published, because you won't be able to get an SPL without a medical at the moment. Well, Ian, in the presentation, and maybe it wasn't clear enough, in the future, like now, under SFCL, there is only one class, is that the right word? One level of examiner. That's flight examiner sailplanes. And flight examiner sailplanes, an FES, can be given privileges to test instructors. So there is no FIE under SFCL, that's disappeared. So it's just FE with different privileges depending on what you've been assessed to do. And there's no 2 exams required per year. That's disappeared. So the restricted instructor medical category is a BGA thing. So unless you can meet the medical requirements, which will be Class 2 or LAPL medical, and we hope for instructors pilot medical declaration, that is the total range of options open to us. So the BGA's restricted instructor medical category will disappear. However, if you as an instructor fly now with experienced pilots, then in theory, in future, you should be able to fly with licensed pilots. But I don't think that really answers your question. The answer is no.